This video is a continuation of my I Played D&D for 1 year video. I highly recommend you watch that one first if you haven't yet. But, as a refresher, this campaign takes place in Nighpel, a country inhabited by the descendants of monsters, myths, and legends. I play a Basan descendant wildfire druid named Flint, whose hobbies include slacking off, being afraid, and making drugs. Other player characters are Floff, a brownie barbarian who enjoys writing smut, working as a blacksmith and cracking heads, and Lauka, a Green Knight descendant fighter who is wholesome and a bit of an airhead. More player characters will join us as this tale unfolds, but that's our cast for now. Let's get started. Before destroying the drug and alcohol operation he spent several weeks building, Flint, along with Floff and Lauka, first needed to rescue their favorite barbecue chef from the elemental plane of fire. See, nestled within the city of Dravania is a small but friendly shop called Barry's Butchers, the owner and proprietor being a magma genasi named Barry. The party had many great hangouts and meals here, and Lauka and Floff would often bring their successful hunts here for some easy gold. Barry's Butchers was essentially the Ichiraku ramen of Nighpel. I say was because one otherwise calm afternoon everything changed. Barry's Butchers suddenly exploded in a massive fire tornado that could be seen all across the city of Dravania, the building collapsing in on itself. The party was the first on scene, and through the ashen frame of what was once their favorite restaurant, no bodies could be recovered, and no trace of Barry remained. Alucard, the son of Dracula and one of the candidates to lead Nighpel in the future, also an evil bastard, arrived at Barry's with a few of his companions. It was quickly determined that the fire was a result of a rift being opened to the elemental plane of fire. Being politically savvy, Alucard quickly explained to the party that both the fire and earth planes had their kings and several successors from each plane recently go missing, leaving Barry in the unfortunate position of being next in line for the throne of both elemental worlds. Thus, desperate for leadership, the residents of the Plane of Fire took Barry by force before the Earth Plane could do the same. Not wanting interplanar politics to get in the way of their barbecue, the party agreed to venture forth into the elemental Plane of Fire and rescue Barry from his own nation. After the necessary preparations were made, Flint, Lauka, Floff, along with their disinterested dragon descendant friend Jason, were teleported into the Plane of Fire. Being the Plane of Fire, it was unreasonably hot. Simply breathing was an uncomfortable chore, drying the mouth and singeing the lungs. The landscape was made up of smoldering compact earth. It was flat, save for a smattering of foothills with seldom traces of where Barry might be. Flint wild-shaped into a wolf, and the party tracked Barry by his barbecue smell. Upon locating the Fire Elemental military compound where Barry was held, Floff scouted ahead for the party. Floff snuck in and overheard in a conversation that Barry was being transported out of the base to a more secure position. Due to some unfortunate stealth rolls, Floff was discovered, the alarm was raised, and the group made haste to intercept Barry before he was taken elsewhere. A brutal fight broke out between the elemental soldiers and the party. Barry himself was also amidst the fighting, seemingly in a trance-like state. Flint struggled to fight the elementals as, despite what the old adage says, fighting fire with fire in D&D is not a good idea. Floff and Lauka were able to hold their own, and through some quick thinking and maneuvering, the party was able to wrench control over Barry. In the meantime, a massive tornado had spun up, threatening to engulf the party in flames. Jason faced down the storm and revealed his true form to the party, that of an ancient, powerful race called the Runeborn. Having transformed into a dragon of equal size, Jason and the fire tornado traded powerful blows, a single of which would have surely been fatal for anyone else present. In the meantime, elemental soldiers rained down arrows at Flint, who was cowering on the ground far away from the battlefield. Lauka was dueling an elemental soldier, but they were evenly matched, and neither side could gain the advantage. The situation was getting dangerous, and in a stroke of genius, Floff approached Barry and attempted to snap him out of his stupor. For a moment, it seemed like Barry was about to attack Floff, but the mist faded from his eyes, and upon seeing the bloodshed and chaos around him, Barry called for a ceasefire. Shortly after, Alucard and his gang joined the party in the Plane of Fire and discussed the political future of Barry's dominion. Afterwards, Barry thanked the party for rescuing him and promised to rebuild his barbecue shop back in Dravania. He was quiet about what he discussed with Alucard, but it appeared some sort of agreement had been reached. The party returned to their home plane, and school in Dravania was back to normal. For Flint, normal was boring, and so he thought to spark some chaos around the school to make things a little more interesting. He hatched a plan for a school-wide panty raid, distributing posters with rules and the promises of a substantial reward for the person who could collect the most student undergarments. It was a perfect scheme, and Flint had nothing to lose, proudly always going commando. While underwear was being pilfered, Lelka and Floff resumed their hunting expeditions, but this one went a little differently. This time, Lelka and Floff came across a squirrel who spoke the common tongue, and seemed a little more dignified than the other squirrels who accompanied him. They were surprised at first, but seeing the utility and usefulness of a talking squirrel, Floff and Lelka struck a deal with him. The squirrel was named Chestnut, and they promised him acorns in return for simple information. They shook on the deal and continued about their hunt, thinking the incident a little strange, but altogether harmless. How they were wrong. The panty raid was an incredible success, with the ladies of Crimson Cross Academy particularly becoming casualties, even some professors. Flint himself stayed out of the fray, preferring to sit back and gleefully watch the chaos unfold. Patrick, the son of Cthulhu, was the obvious winner of the raid. With a huge collection of panties, he streamed out on a clothesline for his victims to ashamedly collect. Even Alucard inadvertently fell prey, collecting his girlfriend's undergarments for her. Floff and Lelka headed out on another hunting expedition and found Chestnut again. Chestnut demanded payment, and with Floff and Lelka having no acorns to show for themselves, Chestnut grew irrational and angry, to the point of being completely maniacal. He revealed his lineage. He was a prince of the Squirrel Kingdom, and, unable to collect what he was owed, he charged forward yelling, "Then you shall pay with your lives." His loyal squirrels attacked alongside him, and after a brief skirmish, Chestnut then fled into the forest, cursing Lelka and Floff, promising that they would rue the day that they decided to break their word and betray him. The forest under their feet would never be safe again. At the end of the week, a tournament hosted by the General Adventurers party was scheduled, pitting fighters in one-on-one duels, with the last one standing being crowned the champion and gifted a gold prize. With gold on the offer, of course the party enlisted. The tournament began, and some interesting new faces joined during the fray. A sharp-tongued vampire named Lysithia threw her glove into the tournament, or would've, but with no one to pick it up for her, she just kept it on. Lysithia was joined by a pale and mysterious banshee descendant named Aisha. While Lysithia was shooting daggers and sneering at anyone who was privileged enough to look at her, Aisha was having a hard time keeping her tongue from wagging, her eyes locked onto the various muscle-bound students gearing up to fight. With the tournament underway, Flint and Aisha were beaten in the first round, and Lysithia was soon to follow. Lelka and Floff fought tooth and nail, swiftly defeating their opponents until it was only the two of them left. The two fought well, but Lelka's precise strikes proved to be a good counter to Floff's hit-and-run strategy, and ultimately Lelka was crowned the victor. Lelka joined her friends, old and new, for a celebration, but it was short-lived. Lelka's younger brother, Mog, came out of nowhere to congratulate her. He had run all the way from the Green Chapel by himself to Crimson Cross Academy, and considering he was only 10 years old, that was mildly concerning. To make matters worse, Lelka had also been given a letter from a raven. The contents were an SOS from Lelka's older sister, Zarin. So, to give you some context, Lelka is a Green Knight descendant, so her family are more or less diplomats between the Pendragon and LeFay families, their homes being the Green Chapel and the Wolf Knight Woods. Zarin had been missing for months, having gone to Sorenstein on an investigative mission. and the letter was written in blood. The party, along with their newfound friends, were ready to go to war for Lauka and wanted to depart right away, but skipping school and traveling to Sorenstein would not be so easy. The forest was now dangerous because of the squirrels, and the train system was fast, but it was too public. Too many people would ask questions why children were off alone by themselves and not in school. If they were to rescue Lauka's sister, they needed a better plan. That night was a fireworks display. The party got together and invited Jason, the Runeborn Dragon, to join them. Flint and Mog being Lauka's younger brother, decided they wanted to sabotage the fireworks and so snuck off to where they were set up. The rest of the party laid down a blanket on the grass and settled in, but Floff caught something out of the corner of their eye and decided to go investigate. Flint was immediately caught by Mr. Horror Freak, the RA of the party. A scarecrow and also a veteran of the Blood Night Moon War, he was good at being unimpressed and handing out detentions like candy on Halloween. Knowing exactly what Flint was up to, Mr. Horror Freak forced Flint to eat a slug-like jelly mixture as punishment for being a little shit. Flint was thoroughly defeated and he slunk back towards the party. But Mog was still nowhere to be seen. Floff, following their instincts, found that Arthur Pendragon and his friends had been drinking while waiting for the fireworks. At first, their behavior seemed normal, but upon getting closer, Floff realized something was definitely wrong. Arthur and his friends were glassy-eyed and aggressive, and upon spotting them, they attacked Floff. Floff was easily able to whack each of them out of their stupor. The group was confused and had little memory of what they had just been doing. Floff looked around and found several bottles of cider on the scene. Shortly after, Floff rejoined the group and explained the strange incident, showing the party one of the bottles. Flint immediately recognized it as one of his own, and having gone into business with Alucard, he concluded that Alucard or one of his friends had somehow poisoned his cider and had given Arthur the foul mixture. It was a devastating blow to Flint, whose purpose for making the cider was simply monetary. He didn't want his invention or work to hurt people, especially the people he loved. Since it had hurt Floff, Flint had already made up his mind about what he had to do. The display began with a bang because Mog flew past the party, hanging on to dear life from a massive firework. Thankfully, the group was able to catch him before he flew up and exploded, and Lauka scolded him before handing him over to Mr. Horror Freak to keep a better eye on. When the fireworks finished, everyone returned to their dorms for bed except Flint. Furious that he was betrayed and his work had been used for evil, Flint went to his makeshift lab behind the school and destroyed everything he could, setting alight his precious cider and blowing his equipment to pieces, along with destroying a staff Patrick had given him. It was a bitter moment, and Flint returned to his bed, planning to take revenge on Patrick for what he had done. A welcoming ceremony for the first-year students was planned the next day, and so family members and dignitaries from across Nighpel were invited to join for a night of feasting, speeches, and celebration. The party debated on how to proceed with their escape plan and talked to Arthur about their options. Arthur was worried for them, but said he would work on a way to help them. They would just have to wait. So, donning their best attire, or for some their only attire, the party headed to the celebration that night. Floff and Lauka met with their parents. Lauka's parents were very congratulatory. They praised her for winning the Gap tournament and said that they were proud of her success in school. Lauka, however, kept the information about her older sister's distress a secret. While Floff's parents were happy to see them, they were disappointed in some of Floff's manners and appearance. Flint overheard this conversation and stood up for Floff, explaining what a good friend Floff had been and what they had already achieved at school. But Flint hadn't come to the party to visit. He was there to get even with Patrick. That morning, Flint and Aisha came up with a devious ploy. They had bought liquid laxative, and the plan was to get the laxative in or on the food given to Patrick, so he would have, let's just say, a shitty night. So, as the waitstaff were serving meals, Flint and Aisha moved in. When the moment was right, Aisha caused a distraction and Flint bumped into a brownie waitress, only managing to splash the laxative on the food headed to Patrick. The brownie was confused, but hadn't caught on to the dirty deed. With that, Flint and Aisha made their way to their respective seats, staring at Patrick, waiting for him to have a bite. The ceremony began with a speech from Van Helsing, a military leader who had not been heard speaking in public for many years. He congratulated the students and wished them a prosperous future. Afterwards, people began to dig into their meal, toasting, and immediately many collapsed dead to their tables. Putif, the son of Van Helsing, had only been exposed to a small amount of the poison and was spasming. Floff's own father collapsed and uttered his final words to Floff before his body grew limp. Flint attempted to see if there's any way to save him, but the poison was too fast and powerful. Lelka leapt over to Putif and shoved a healing potion down his throat, which seemed to have been just enough to stabilize him. In the chaos, the server, the same Flint had bumped into, dashed outside. Aisha chased after her, and in their rage, Floff cursed them, tracking the server as well. The party followed the brownie out onto the streets and into the rain. Her body melted away, her claws elongated, revealing her undead nature. During the ensuing fight, the brownie taunted the party, telling them her name was Mary, and that she served a cult called the Silent Council. The party managed to capture Mary and slammed her with questions. Mary had been killed in a disaster called the Open Maw Incident, and now undead, she wished to enact her revenge upon the living. Before the party could question her further, a fireball crashed into the middle of the interrogation, killing Mary and wounding everyone else. It had been cast by a hooded figure who ran off into the night. The party picked themselves up, empty-handed except for a seal with the sigil of the Silent Council. The rest of the night was spent reporting the incident, grieving, and lost as to what the next step might be. The next day, the party picked themselves up, offered their condolences to Floff, and met with Arthur. In light of the attack the night before, students who participated in the GAP tournament and deemed combat worthy were allowed to accompany guests and families home and serve as protection detail. Arthur had pulled some strings, and the party were given allowance to accompany Floff's mother and Lelka's parents to the forest just before Sorenstein, where the party would then, and I quote, get lost hiking. Arthur informed them that this was the best way to get to Sorenstein without raising too much suspicion, and Floff agreed, as they wanted to be close to their mother and help her bring her husband home. The party offered no dissent and set out that morning. The journey started off without a hitch, the party distributing themselves among the caravan and serving as lookouts. During a rest, Flint and Aisha started having a discussion. Aisha's brother had been at the party the night before and seemed obsessed with her, showing random people Aisha's baby pictures from a library of scrapbooks. However, Flint saw Alucard and Aisha's brother having a disagreement and so brought it up to her. Aisha's only comment was that her brother was a bad person and she hated him and would kill him in an instant. Flint laughed and said that he had a family member just like that. The two jokingly made a murder pact and bonded over shared childhood trauma. Flint and Floff also had a discussion, whereby Flint told Floff that their father's passing was a terrible tragedy, but also a chance to get stronger, as no sapling can grow in the shade of a mighty oak. Floff understood the sentiment, although thought Flint was maybe being a little harsh. When the party pitched their tents that first night, Lelka and Floff noticed Mog wandering off in the forest alone. At first they thought maybe he just had to go to the loo, but when Mog didn't return for several minutes, they woke up the rest of the party and followed his path. And good thing too, as Mog had found himself surrounded by a gang of feral vampires, who pounced on him. The party sprung into action, blasting back the vampires, but despite their efforts, Mog sustained a swipe across his cheek, large enough to certainly scar. When the last vampire was crushed underfoot, Alithia and Lelka got into an argument about Mog. Alithia claimed Mog was poorly trained, and Lelka and her parents were failures, just like Mog. Lelka was furious, and the argument spilled over to the next day. When Lelka's parents discovered that Mog had been injured the night before, they scolded her for not properly protecting her little brother. When Flint heard this, he exploded on Lelka's parents, telling them that they were the irresponsible ones and that blaming Lelka was pure idiocy. Alithia also joined Flint's side, repeating that Lelka's parents had failed to properly train Mog. Floff agreed with Lelka and was very adamant that Mog was just a child and shouldn't be expected to protect himself from the horrors of the world yet. In the resulting arguments, Lauka snapped and challenged Alithia to a duel. Flint felt he needed to defend Lauka from her parents, even if paradoxically that meant he had to fight her to do so, and so called for a 2v2. The duel was set, Mog and Lauka versus Flint and Alithia. Immediately, the fight started with Alithia and Flint blasting off powerful magic. Flint managed to strike Mog with a bolt of lightning, knocking him out cold. Lauka shrugged off Alithia's blast of eldritch energy and clocked her with her sword. Flint ran back and pelted Lauka with lightning until her head fell off. The battle was called there, and Fluff furiously stormed off. Victorious in a fight with no winners, Flint took the opportunity to scold Lauka's parents for being irresponsible and out of touch, Flint's own experience with his father fueling his rage. After that, everyone bitterly separated and spent time on their own cooling off. Feelings were hurt, and all hope of teamwork seemed lost, and the journey had only just begun. After a cooling off period, the party awkwardly regrouped and redistributed themselves throughout the caravan. Fluff and Flint shared seating, and Fluff confronted Flint about the duel. Flint explained that he fought Lauka and Mog to prove a point to Lauka's parents. He had hurt them to help them, almost like cauterizing a wound with fire. Fluff explained that he understood Flint's intentions, but that the situation was way out of control, that using potentially lethal magic, especially on a child, was hugely irresponsible. Flint agreed, but added it's not exactly like he's an adult either, being only 15 years old. Flint produced Fluff's bong, which Fluff had loaned him earlier, and the two made amends. Fluff had a similar conversation with Alithia and managed to persuade the young vampire that whatever culture and preconceptions she had about child soldiers were incredibly immoral and warped. Alithia explained that in Sorenstein, where she grew up, she and other vampires are trained to fight and kill at a very young age. So in her eyes, Mog's lack of ability made him weak and a failure for those responsible for training him. Common ground was eventually found between Fluff and Alithia offered an apology, maybe a little tongue-in-cheek, but Fluff was satisfied. At the next stop, the caravan was now close to the woods near Sorenstein, meaning it was time for the party to, and I quote, go for a hike. The woods were a normally dangerous place, but the party had also made powerful woodland enemies of the furry variety. A few hours in, Flint's foot hit a rope, and he was hoisted into the air, as squirrels and giant wasps surrounded the party. Lauka and Fluff's nemesis, Chestnut, led the charge, and the squirrels put up a surprisingly good fight, but being squirrels, they eventually got their asses handed to them. Chestnut sustained heavy injuries, but before the party could capture him, he managed to slip away, abandoning his squirrel soldiers, shouting curses all the while. Now deep in enemy territory, the party was extra vigilant moving forward, looking for evidence of another squirrel ambush. Instead, they came to a section of the forest that was heavily corrupted. Trees were rotting, grass was wilting, leaves were curling and twisting with purple energy. The air itself smelled sour. The corrupted forest was far from empty, however, a far-off rustling indicating the presence of something not particularly friendly. Hoping to understand the corruption, Flint cast Speak with Plants and interrogated a tree he named Professor Oak. Professor Oak wheezed and told him that an ancient tree called the Galtheus tree was corrupting the surrounding forest, and that many dangers lurked ahead. The party was unsure where Lauka's sister was being held, but such a massive corruption in the forest close to Sorenstein seemed like a good place to start. Treading carefully as not to bring undue attention to themselves, the party pushed forward, deep into the heart of the corruption. After a few hours of travel, the party arrived at an open clearing, with a massive twisted tree on the far side, complete with a hornet the size of a small dragon buzzing around it. It didn't take a genius to realize that this was the Galtheus tree Professor Oak had spoken of. Adjacent to it was a dilapidated mansion, with broken windows, several sections caved in, and the surrounding grass was well overgrown. After a quick scout from Lauka and Fluff, the party inched their way towards the mansion. After somebody failed a stealth roll, the surrounding forest and grass began to rustle, and nasty humanoid figures of gnarled wood and mud, twig blights, sprang forth. The party cut these down, but more and more began to pile in, and the dragon hornet seemed to have realized a commotion was coming in the direction of the mansion. Flint panicked and climbed up and into a collapsed part of the mansion along with Aisha, and from their elevated position the two could see hooded figures with symbols of the Silent Council fast approaching around the corner. As Fluff, Lelka, and Alithia struck back the twig blights, Aisha and Flint unleashed a barrage of fire and magic, shooting the two cultists dead just as they rounded the corner. The Hornet was undoubtedly alerted at this point, and the ground shook, causing Flint and Aisha to fall into the mansion. Lelka, Fluff, and Alithia retreated to the front door and threw themselves inside. Party had been separated. Flint and Aisha proceeded to shit themselves, but upon somewhat gaining their composure and tiring of cowering behind one another, the two began their descent into the mansion. The hallways were old, creaking underfoot, and smelled of mildew and mold. Eventually, the two came to a room filled with dolls. Creeped out, but also curious, the two entered, and immediately one doll, a bunny, looked up at both of them. Flint felt an overwhelming urge to approach the doll, and upon touching it, a voice rang out in his head. It was a child's voice, asking if he wanted to play. Flint agreed and began talking to the doll. Aisha was incredibly confused, but seeing no immediate harm come to Flint, decided to just roll with it. Flint informed Aisha the rabbit doll said they needed to go down, finding a trap door, and upon jumping down, the two entered an old dungeon, built long before the mansion on top had ever been conceived. The walls and floor were layered with dust and cobwebs. Aisha and Flint came to a metal grate, and through the rusting bars, they were treated to a horrific sight. The skeletal corpses of 4 children lay around an altar. Demonic runes spread underneath them. Holding the bunny doll, the spirit inside directed Flint's eyes to one of the corpses and said, "That's me." Speechless, Flint and Aisha stood frozen in silence for several minutes. Aisha was the first to break the silence, coming to a separate realization. In history class, she had learned that Nighpel had gone through a horrific and bloody civil war called the Blood Night Moon War. Now, the catalyst for this conflict was the disappearance of 4 children, whose remains, even hundreds of years later, had yet to be discovered. And here they were, standing right before them. Solemn, disgusted, and angry, now knowing it was the Silent Council who had goaded Nighpel into the Blood Night Moon War and had kidnapped and murdered children to do so, Aisha and Flint continued down into the dungeon, but not just for the purposes of escape. Not anymore. Meanwhile, Lelka and Fluff were locked in mortal combat with a powerful wraith. Lelka eventually killed it, but not before Fluff was gravely wounded. Running now, the two busted through the upper floors of the mansion, coming across 2 stuffed animals of their own and a laboratory, indicating the Silent Council was involved with the demon god of death, Orcus. There they met a few captured civilians as well as Alithia's vampire aunt named Saphira, who was obviously overjoyed to be freed. However, the upper floor was not without its own perils. An undead creature rolled into a ball of bone and rotten flesh with 1 large eye and a couple eye stalks kindly greeted them. By kindly, I mean it nearly killed both Lelka and Fluff, paralyzing them with its eye rays, but the two scraped by the skin of their teeth, beating the undead creature back to just being dead. After its defeat, dust cascaded from the ceiling above, and the mansion began to shake violently, the old wood moaning and breaking apart. The newly formed trio raced towards the entrance as the building broke apart around them. Unaware of the life-or-death battles raging just above their heads, Flint and Aisha snuck through a labyrinth guarded by skeletal minotaurs, somehow managing to stay undetected, and while searching for Silent Council members to murder, the two came across a jail cell. Inside was a chained demon descendant named Zarthos. He looked tired, half-starved, and his wrists bled from rubbing against their metal shackles. Flint and Aisha decided whether to rescue the demon man, eventually deciding if he was an enemy of the Silent Council and imprisoned, then he was an ally of theirs. Also, Aisha had a hard time peeling her eyes off of his muscles, or what was left of them. With her new ally in tow, Aisha and Flint ripped through the dungeon, destroying demonic effigies, coming across a stuffed animal for Aisha, shooting any stray cult members unfortunate enough to be in the way, and eventually infiltrating the inner sanctum of the Silent Council. The cult members had gathered into a small cathedral, sitting in pews, listening to a speech given by their leader, proudly going over their accomplishments. All eyes turned to Aisha and Flint as they entered, and upon giving each other a nod, the duo opened fire. Literally, because Aisha threw a fireball into the middle of the pews, and Flint shot scorching rays at anyone who found themselves outside of the blast range. The sitting cultists were vaporized, screaming bones and all into piles of ash. The duo continued blasting down the cultists, and Zarthos crushed any who managed to get too close, until only one remained. Using techniques that may or may not break the Geneva Conventions, Flint and Aisha learned that Lauka's sister Zarin was being held somewhere within Sorenstein, and that the Silent Council had plans to destroy that town. While discussing how best to burn someone to death, Zarthos put the cultist out of his misery, and the three headed back towards the surface. Along the way, Aisha happened upon an interesting-looking dagger, and carefully picked it up, without touching the metal directly, stowing it away for later. Closing in on the surface, the trio entered a room stuffed full of gigantic, writhing roots, and floating in the air was an eyeless, open-mouthed demon looking something straight out of a scream painting. He watched the three curiously. Zarthos warned them that this demon was none other than Daneth the Foul, a servant of Orcus. Aisha attempted to attack Daneth, and as if to prove a point, Daneth was easily able to knock her unconscious. Daneth watched the three curiously for a moment, and then warned them that the destruction of the Galtheus tree would only bring Orcus more power. With that, the demon teleported away. The roots began to writhe violently, threatening to cave the chamber in. Picking up Aisha, the three bolted up and onto the surface. Topside, the Galtheus tree was locked into combat with Lauka, Floff, Saphira, and Alithia, who had beaten the giant dragon wasp to death. Bloody, singed, and pissed, the floor ripped apart swarms of twig blights. Lauka, when given a spare moment, hacked away at the base of the tree, sticky sap pouring out like blood. However, the twig blights became too much, and just as they were getting surrounded, Flint, Aisha, and a buff demon man burst from underground and fired into the twiggy monsters. With reinforcements, the blights stood no chance, and with a few triumphant strikes, Lauka felled the wicked tree. The party assured everyone was safe and then fled from the clearing as the mansion collapsed in on itself behind them. Once a safe distance in the forest, everyone recounted their tales to one another and shared what they had learned of the Silent Council. Flint and Aisha came to an agreement called Don't Tell Lauka, where they left out some of the particularities of what they did to the Silent Council, instead talking about how they nobly protected themselves from the mean cultists and certainly didn't find any treasure while doing so. The party had a shared sense of victory, serving the Silent Council their first major defeat. With that, the party headed to Sorenstein, and somewhere, Lauka's sister Zarin awaited them. Upon arriving in Sorenstein, the party met with various members of Alithia's family. All of them hated that Flint also referred to them as uncle or auntie. As they walked, young vampires were training relentlessly and brutally in the streets around them. Another standout thing, the town seemed to be divided between werewolves and vampires, the vampires belonging more to the upper class and the werewolves the lower class. This segregation caused visible tension that the party could easily pick up by simply walking through the streets. For example, a fight broke out between a werewolf and a vampire, the both of them smashing through a bar window. Just before things got too heated, guards arrived and separated the two, who continued yelling obscenities at each other as they were pulled away. At Alithia's mansion, the party recounted their findings to Vincent Daskow, the vampire lord in charge of Sorenstein in Soren's absence, and another one of Alithia's uncles that Flint also insisted on calling uncle. The party then made the intelligent decision to get wickedly drunk with Alithia's aunt Saphira and explore the town. In their stupor, they climbed the clock tower and found that the time wasn't running like a normal 24-hour clock. Instead, the hands were moving as if counting down. The next morning, everyone's stuffed animals had gathered together and seemed to be enjoying breakfast with one another. It was an odd and unnerving sight, and the party themselves ate quickly. Their first lead was a gravekeeper named Alabaster Crypt. He was an undead man who had supposedly gone a little mad, and spent his time fruitlessly attempting to repair an old abandoned section of Sorenstein, aptly named Old Sorenstein. While searching for Alabaster, the party heard the sound of what seemed like Chestnut the squirrel prints coming from one building. Curious and working cautiously, the party entered. What followed was a trap-ridden death house with false stairs, spikes, and magical explosives. On the top floor, the party was waylaid by horrific undead squirrels which scratched and chattered their way through the walls of the house and attacked them. These were the same squirrels they had fought but not killed in their earlier battle with Chestnut in the forest. Horrified, the party pushed onward, with Chestnut's voice continuing to taunt them. Finally, on the top floor, the party did not find Chestnut, but a magical mouth speaking to them. Through it, Chestnut proudly told the party that he had allied with the Silent Council in order to destroy them. Flint caught a whiff of gasoline, yelled for everyone to get out of the house, and the party all jumped through a window as the building exploded behind them. Hitting the ground, the party landed at the feet of none other than Alabaster Crypt. Alabaster was rightly upset, as it appeared the party had just blown one of his recreated buildings to smithereens. Alabaster hefted his shovel, ready to beat some ass, but Lelka talked him down, explaining how they had just been attacked by the Silent Council. Upon the mention of the Silent Council, Alabaster's entire demeanor changed, and he quickly ushered the party to follow him to his home. Just as Flint and Fluff were about to set foot on Alabaster's doorstep, the world around them shimmered, several squids floating around them, and with a flash of purple energy, they found themselves in the middle of a desert, lost, and with no sign of civilization in sight. After wandering aimlessly for a couple hours, getting heatstroke, dehydrated, and seriously sunburned, figures on horseback approached them. The three figures were a djinn, a lizard folk, and a brownie, very similar in appearance to Fluff. As the riders got closer, it was evident that this was Fluff's father, and upon asking about the year, it was about 100 years in the past. Confused about how they got teleported through time and space, but in desperate need of water and shade, Flint and Fluff gladly accepted the rescue and were taken to a desert camp. While there, Fluff overheard a meeting where a Rakshasa and his father were arguing over something, eventually making a deal. Turns out, Fluff's father was here on a diplomatic mission attempting to get safer working conditions for brownie slaves, as cave-ins, accidents, and other mistreatment had killed many brownies, and this was obviously a massive issue. Meanwhile, Flint was doing God's work, collecting cactus bulbs to throw at people, and spotted what looked like a giant purple worm. Flint freaked out and retreated back to camp. That night, Flint and Fluff accompanied Fluff's father to the open maw. It was near enough the worst place they had ever been. The open maw was an open pit mine, with wooden beams and rickety scaffolding built leading down to hundreds of separate mine shafts. Various overseers were whipping brownies into action, herding them like animals to their next assignment. The brownies' hands and feet were shackled to one another, and if someone collapsed or died of exhaustion, the rest were forced to carry the body along with them as literal dead weight. The sounds of whipping, cries, and mining picks against stone echoed throughout the area. It was night, so flickering dim oil lamps were the only illumination offered. In one particular mineshaft, Flint and Fluff came across a familiar brownie. It was Mary, the very same brownie who had killed Fluff's father in the future. Covertly, hoping to change the future in some way, Fluff slipped her a dagger and continued on their way. At the bottom of the open maw, it looked like a hooded figure had planted large eggs. Flint and Fluff were climbing down to investigate when a gigantic purple worm burst from the ground below. The duo could do nothing to fight against such a massive creature, and chained and shackled as tightly as they were, saving any brownie slaves was also impossible. Flint and Fluff were helpless to intervene. Their only option was to run back up the open maw as it collapsed behind them. Flint lost his footing on a jump and would have tumbled down to his death, but Fluff spun around and grabbed Flint's hand, hoisting him up. Escaping the pit, and deeply disturbed by the incident, the two found Fluff's father and explained that the Silent Council may have been behind this incident. Not wanting to interfere with the past anymore, they said nothing else, and as they were trotting defeated back to the camp, Flint and Fluff were teleported once again, finding themselves back on Alabaster's doorstep, sand pouring off of them. Alabaster proceeded to get everyone comfortable, make tea, and give confused glances in the direction of Flint and Floff. Once everyone was settled, Alabaster explained how he had been fighting against the Silent Council his entire life, and that the council had stolen his son from him. Aisha had been looking around Alabaster's living room and noticed a picture of Alabaster's family. The stuffed animal in Aisha's pack piped up and said, "That's me." Aisha took her stuffed animal and gave it to Alabaster, allowing the spirit of his child to speak with him. After a long silence, the party explained what occurred at the Gultheus tree. Alabaster's child was one of the children who had been kidnapped and killed, and whose soul now resided inside a stuffed animal. Aisha vowed to Alabaster that she would help him with all her available might to put an end to the Silent Council for what they had done. After this revelation, Alabaster thanked the party, tears in his eyes, gripping his shovel tighter than ever. He told the party that he had noticed some weird activity in the graveyard, and if the Silent Council had resurfaced, that would be the best place to start looking. The party decided to investigate, and Alabaster gave the stuffed animal back to Aisha, telling him to watch over them. In preparation, the party had a conversation with Lelka's messenger falco named Shiko, who has a Boston accent, and Flint and Floff explained the weird teleportation they experienced, how the Silent Council was also in the shadows, pulling the strings at the Open Maw incident. Solving a quick puzzle at the graveyard, the party gained access to a crypt and descended bravely into the darkness. First, they were attacked by a maniacal woman, surrounded by blood and bones. Flint's doll cried out, "Mother," but before Flint could intervene, Lelka and Floff dispatched the woman. Upon reading her journal, the party discovered she had joined the Silent Council to protect her son, sacrificing people and spilling their blood in hopes to keep him safe. Ultimately, her son became a victim of the very thing she hoped would protect him. Flint attempted to console his spirit, but he found little success. Another member of the Silent Council and another parent of one of the dolls, a redcap, attacked the party. Like the crazed woman before, this redcap was far beyond negotiating with, and the party was given no choice to put her down. Pushing their way through the crypt and dispatching any other Silent Council members they found, the party stopped for a moment to rest. Aisha thought to scout ahead in her ethereal form, and when she didn't return, Flint summoned direwolves and the party rode them through the crypt and into battle. They entered a chamber filled with Silent Council cultists and a powerful dark mage overseeing an active demonic ritual. Noble hostages were held captive over blood-red runes, their lives moments away from being stolen. Aisha's unconscious body was being dragged away behind the ritual. With no time to lose, Lelka and Floff charged forwards at the nobles in an attempt to save them, and Flint brought his wolf around to Aisha, teleporting her out of harm's way. The party worked quickly, fighting to stop whatever ritual was being conducted, but the cultists merely killed themselves to complete it, their souls siphoned from their bodies and empowering the runes on the floor. Once again, the earth shook. The dark mage managed to slip away in the chaos of the fight, and upon chasing her outside, the party couldn't believe their eyes. The Church of Shorenstein had been lifted by magical means, taking an island along underneath of it, far above the town, fresh dirt and stone still trickling off the structure. Booming from the church came the witch's voice. Shorenstein now must choose its fate. Either the vampires must die or the werewolves must die, and if no decision is made, both will be eradicated. It must be decided before midnight. Understandably, the townspeople were in an uproar, and they were scared and confused about what was happening. Thankfully, the town guards were able to hold on to order and keep the vampires and werewolves from immediately ripping each other apart. Even so, cries and threats of death could be heard from both sides. Vincent Daskow made an appearance to the gathering crowds and gave a speech, saying that he would not allow whatever foul magic was afoot to destroy his brother's home, and he would have the people responsible for this ridiculous assault executed. His words seemingly managed to keep the peace, but tension was bubbling up beneath the surface. How long the peace would last was anyone's guess. The party joined a meeting with various leaders and adults they had met in Shorenstein and discussed their next step in thwarting the Silent Council's plans. It was agreed that the party would teleport themselves, along with Saphira, and attempt to intervene with whatever was going on up there. In the meantime, the rest of the adults would be needed on the ground to keep the peace between the werewolves and the vampires. Unsure what exactly they might be in for, the party braced themselves and teleported up into the flying cathedral. Staying low and quiet, the party took a quick look around before things got too heated. They noticed that beside the church rested these huge eldritch cannons, loaded with organic bombs. Purple veins and stringy vines wrapped around them. Large piles of these bombs were scattered throughout and around the church, and the party didn't wait to find out what they would do. Instead, they crashed into the church and fought their way to the top. In some of the resulting explosions, they accidentally detonated one of these bombs. Horrifically, gas released from it and Lelka breathed it in. Her eyes went dark and a rage took over her. Aisha was able to cast Remove Curse and free Lelka, but not before Lelka had seriously injured Floff, stabbing and slashing them multiple times. The party realized then and there that if they didn't stop the Silent Council, these bombs would rain down upon the town, and the werewolves and vampires would be forced to tear each other apart, as if they needed any help doing that already. Running up the second floor, the party encountered Daneth the Foul, who was busy in a magic ritual designed to hold up the entire structure. The party wanted to fight him, but dropping a church full of bombs on Sorenstein seemed like a bad idea, so they left Daneth be, but not before taunting and hazing the shit out of him. On the final floor, Gwendolyn and Zarin stood waiting, their eyes shimmering with red magic. 4 braziers surrounded them, the fire casting long shadows across the room. Everyone's favorite witch stood atop a platform, sneering down as the party stepped forward. Lelka called out to her sister, but it was to no avail, as it seemed Zarin and Gwen were deep under some sort of mind control. With no other choice, Lelka hefted her axe, and Zarin lifted her blade. The 2 siblings clashed, and the fight was on. Immediately, Floff lent aid to Lelka, hammering on Zarin's armor. Aisha began a duel with Gwendolyn, exchanging hefty magical barrages. An old inscription was written on the far side of the room, and Flint quickly read through it. It was something about the braziers in the room. Flint attempted to control the flames and extinguish them, but could not. The inscription mentioned a sacrifice, a freeing of a trapped soul, and in that moment Flint came to a horrible realization. It seemed his stuffed animal did too. Flint attempted to comfort the spirit, saying that they would be free and maybe would be reunited with their family. The spirit replied that upon death it was not going to meet its family. Due to their actions in life, it was certain they would not end up in the same place. Sullenly, Flint placed his stuffed animal into the fire, and after the last tuft of its fur was reduced to ash, the brazier was extinguished. Zarin and Gwen staggered, their mind control slipping for a moment, and following Flint's lead, each member of the party offered their stuffed animals to the flames, fleeing the trapped spirits of the children within. When the final stuffy was burned, Zarin and Gwen nearly collapsed, and in a last attempt to kill someone, the witch threw herself at Floff and detonated. Floff managed to jump clear, and when the smoke lifted, no trace of the enemy spellcaster remained. With the Silent Council soundly defeated and Gwen and Zarin free, the party took a moment to catch their breath, but noticed through the broken glass of the church that Daneth and an undead beholder had been watching them. The 2 creatures did what they do best and teleported away. The church began to tilt, as without anyone channeling magic into the floating island, it was now on a collision course with Sorenstein. With not a second to lose, Aisha and Floff ran down and channeled their magical energy into the island, attempting to steer it away, crashing it as far away from civilization as possible. Flint summoned giant eagles for everyone, and the rest of the party took to the skies. Aisha and Floff managed to successfully push the island away, but in doing so, caused the platform to tilt so strongly that the bombs outside shifted, and then began to roll off the edge, down onto the town below. The party watched helplessly, devastated and horrified, as all their hard work saving Sorenstein was about to go up in flames. Floff and Aisha, unaware of what had just happened, jumped on their eagle and took off. Everyone watched as the island crashed into Old Sorenstein, reducing the dilapidated buildings and the reconstructed ones built by Alabaster to rubble. And I think that's all for this video. This is going to be a two-parter because me reading the entire script, which is like an hour and a half's worth all at once, is pretty hard on the voice. So you'll get the other half of the story in the next upcoming video. Thank you for watching, and see you there.